A Hispanic family's dream vacation takes a shocking turn when a racist flight attendant humiliates them in front of the entire plane. But the captain's unexpected heroism turns everything around. Find out what happens next and how this family's stand against injustice changes their lives forever. Subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, a sunny, much-awaited family getaway. Carlos, his wife Maria, and their two kids, Sofia and Diego, had been counting down the days. The flight was booked, the bags were packed, and the excitement was in the air as they headed to the airport. The kids couldn't stop talking about the adventures ahead, while Maria and Carlos shared a quiet smile, ready for some well-deserved relaxation. As the family made their way onto the plane, everything seemed normal. The flight attendants greeted them with friendly smiles, and they found their seats, Maria and Carlos by the window, with Sofia and Diego seated beside them. The plane was filled with the typical hustle of travelers getting settled. But there was one thing they didn't expect. One thing that would soon turn their trip into a nightmare. As the doors of the plane closed, the flight attendants began their routine safety announcements. And that's when Carlos noticed her. The flight attendant who was working the aisle, checking on the passengers, her name tag read Emily, had a cold look in her eyes. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she barely made eye contact with him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But then, as Emily moved down the aisle, she stopped right in front of their row. She gave Carlos a quick, dismissive glance before turning to Maria. "You'll have to pull your seat up, ma'am," she said, in a tone that was far too harsh for something so simple. Maria, confused, looked up. "It's up," she replied, gesturing to the seat back in front of her. But Emily shook her head, her lips tight. "No, you need to pull it up. Now." Carlos, feeling the tension, stood up to see what was going on. He could feel the unease settling in, a strange weight in the air. Maria, who had been a frequent flyer, knew the drill when it came to seatbacks. But something about the way Emily was acting, almost aggressive as if they were a burden, made it clear that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. "Excuse me," Carlos said politely, "but our seats are already up. Is there a problem?" Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, and with a cold sneer, she snapped, "Just follow the rules." "It's not that hard, you know." The word stung. The look in Emily's eyes was more than just a little rude. It was disrespectful, dismissive, and filled with something else Carlos couldn't quite place, but it felt wrong. He glanced at Maria, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Sofia and Diego, sensing the tension, stopped chattering and looked up at their parents, unsure of what was happening. Carlos didn't want to make a scene, but there was no denying the tension in the air. Before he could respond, Emily turned away without another word, walking briskly down the aisle, leaving the family in a stunned silence. Maria quietly leaned in toward Carlos. "What was that about?" she whispered. Carlos shook his head, not sure himself. "I don't know," he muttered. But that wasn't right. And just as they thought things couldn't get worse, the flight continued, and the real humiliation began. As the plane soared into the sky, the family tried to shake off the uncomfortable encounter with Emily. Carlos, Maria, Sofia, and Diego did their best to focus on their upcoming vacation, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. What was supposed to be an exciting journey was quickly turning into something else entirely. The flight attendants continued their routine. But Carlos couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Why had Emily been so rude? And why had she singled them out? The more he thought about it, the more it seemed personal. His family wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting there, minding their own business, ready to enjoy a vacation. But there was something about the way she looked at them, something behind her cold eyes, that made it feel like they didn't belong. It wasn't just an oversight. It felt like a silent judgment. Maria noticed the shift in Carlos's mood and gently touched his hand. "Don't let it get to you," she said softly, trying to reassure him. But her voice betrayed the unease she was feeling as well. "Maybe it's just a misunderstanding." She seemed frustrated, or in a hurry. Carlos nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. Maria wasn't wrong, but he felt like this was more than a simple mistake. As the flight continued, it seemed as though they were constantly in Emily's line of sight. Whenever she walked by, her gaze would linger on them for a second longer than necessary, her eyes narrowing, as if she was silently judging them. The tension only grew when she returned to their row to serve drinks. This time, she stopped directly in front of their seats, staring at Carlos as if waiting for him to speak. The silence stretched on, uncomfortable and thick. Carlos, trying to avoid a scene, simply said, "2 waters, please." But Emily didn't move. Instead, she stood there, her expression almost mocking. "Excuse me?" Carlos said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Are you sure you want water?" Emily replied with a smirk. Her tone had changed. Gone was the professionalism, replaced by something colder, sharper. "You know, you don't look like the type who drinks water," she added, glancing at Maria and then back at Carlos. "You're more of a soda person, aren't you? Or maybe something stronger." Carlos froze, his face going red. What was she implying? He looked at his wife, who was now visibly uncomfortable. "We'll just have the water," he said, his voice colder now, trying to keep control of the situation. Emily rolled her eyes, but finally she handed them the cups of water. But the damage was done. The condescending, judgmental attitude was unmistakable. It was no longer just an isolated incident. It was harassment. Emily was making them feel like they were somehow less than everyone else on the plane, as if they didn't belong there. The family fell silent. Sophia and Diego, sensing the tension, clutched their little hands together, their eyes wide with confusion. They didn't understand what was happening, but they could feel that something wasn't right. The joy they had once felt about the trip was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable uncertainty that seemed to grow with every passing minute. It wasn't long before Maria couldn't take it anymore. She stood up and walked toward the galley where the flight attendants were gathered, her steps purposeful. Carlos watched her, unsure of what she was planning to do, but he knew this wasn't something they could ignore any longer. Maria approached the flight attendants, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, I need to speak with someone in charge," she said, looking around until she made eye contact with the senior flight attendant, who was standing near the back. The senior flight attendant, a woman with a warm smile, walked over to Maria. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Not really," Maria replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Your colleague Emily has been rude and discriminatory toward my family. We've been humiliated by her behavior." The senior flight attendant's smile faltered, and she quickly glanced back at Emily, who was now at the front of the plane. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Let me talk to her right away. Please, take your seat, and we'll make sure this is addressed." Maria nodded, but as she turned to walk back to their seats, Carlos met her halfway. He had been watching the exchange, and now he stood beside her, his eyes focused. "What happened?" he asked. "Emily needs to be held accountable for what she's done," Maria said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "This isn't right. We can't let her get away with it." Carlos agreed, but the situation wasn't over yet. It was becoming clear that Emily was not just some rogue employee. This was something bigger. Was she the only one with this mindset? Was this the culture of the airline? How many other passengers had been treated this way and never spoken up? Carlos felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility to make sure it didn't happen again. Not just for their family, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. When they returned to their seats, Emily was gone, replaced by the senior flight attendant. She apologized profusely, assuring the family that the issue was being addressed. "Please know that we take these matters seriously," she said. "You should never feel discriminated against, especially on our flights. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Maria smiled faintly, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. The humiliation was something they couldn't easily forget. The flight continued, but now the family's excitement for the vacation had shifted to something more complicated. Carlos glanced at his children, who were now sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm that had briefly shaken their world. He thought about the example they were setting for them. His mind was clear now. This wasn't just about one rude flight attendant. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about making sure that their children grew up in a world where they could speak out when something was wrong, where they could fight for justice without fear of retaliation. And as the plane touched down at their destination, Carlos felt something change. The flight might have been a nightmare, but it had sparked something inside him. This was more than just a trip. This was a chance to teach his family that standing up to injustice wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. The courage to speak out, to make things right, was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the plane touched down, the family felt a mix of emotions. Their vacation destination was in sight, but the weight of the events aboard the flight still hung heavily on them. The joy of travel, the excitement of new experiences, seemed distant compared to the challenge they had just faced. Yet, amid the discomfort, there was also a sense of pride. They had spoken up. They had taken action, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. Maria was the first to speak as they disembarked. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "This isn't just about Emily. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. We need to hold them accountable." Carlos nodded. He had spent the entire flight thinking about the choice they had to make: let it go, or make sure their voice was heard. The easy option would have been to simply walk away, but they couldn't. Not after what had happened. They were a family, and they would stand together. As they walked through the terminal, they were met by the airline's customer service team. The senior flight attendant, who had apologized earlier, was there to meet them. She introduced herself as Susan, and her demeanor was far warmer than Emily's had been. "I just want to thank you again for bringing this to our attention," she said, looking sincerely at Carlos and Maria. "We've already begun investigating the matter, and I promise we'll do everything we can to ensure something like this never happens again." Maria smiled, though there was still a fire in her eyes. "Thank you. But I want to make sure you understand how serious this is. It's not just about Emily's behavior. It's about a culture, a mindset that allows people to feel they can treat others as less than. We can't let that go unnoticed." Carlos added, "We'll be following up. This is just the beginning. No family, no person, should ever have to feel like we did today. And if we don't hold these actions accountable, then we're letting it happen to someone else." Susan's expression softened. "I understand completely. We'll make sure this is addressed, not just with Emily, but across the entire airline. This is a teaching moment, and we take your feedback seriously." As they walked away, Carlos felt a sense of relief. The family had done what they set out to do. They had stood up, they had spoken out, and they had made sure their voices were heard. No, the vacation wouldn't be perfect. The stain of Emily's behavior would linger for a while. But the journey they had just embarked on, the one that would take them toward justice, was far more important. That evening, as the family settled into their hotel, something miraculous happened. The phone rang in their hotel room, and Carlos answered it to find the airline's customer service team on the other end. "We wanted to personally apologize for the experience you had during your flight," the representative said. "We've looked into the matter, and Emily is no longer part of our team. She has been terminated for her behavior. We hope this demonstrates our commitment to making things right." Carlos was stunned. He wasn't expecting such a swift and serious response. The thought that Emily, whose actions had caused them so much grief, was no longer working for the airline, brought a sense of justice and relief, but it also felt like a bittersweet victory. They hadn't wanted to see anyone lose their job, but Emily's actions had gone far beyond the line of what was acceptable. "What will happen now?" Carlos asked, still processing the news. "Your family's experience is being used to train other employees about cultural sensitivity and respect. We're putting new policies in place to ensure that this never happens again," the representative assured him. Maria, overhearing the conversation, gave Carlos a knowing look. This was more than just an apology. It was a promise of change. Change that would ripple out far beyond their family and affect others too. They had done more than just stand up for themselves. They had made sure that the voices of other families, who might not have had the courage to speak up, would now be heard. Later that night, as they sat down to dinner in their hotel room, the family felt the weight of the experience begin to lift. The emotional tension of the flight, the frustration, the hurt, it was all still there, but it had been tempered by something stronger, a sense of purpose. Carlos raised his glass to his family. "We didn't let it slide," he said. "We stood up, and we made sure our voices were heard. And because of that, things will change, not just for us, but for everyone." Maria smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "This is what we teach our children, that their voices matter, that they don't have to accept being treated unfairly." Sofia and Diego, who had been quietly listening, looked up at their parents with wide eyes. For them, this wasn't just a story about a family vacation gone wrong. It was a story about standing up for what's right, about justice, and about never backing down. As the night wore on, the family's laughter and conversation slowly began to return to what it should have been all along: joy and excitement for the vacation ahead. But they would never forget the lessons they had learned on that plane, the lessons about courage, integrity, and fighting for what's right. And as they prepared to head to their next destination the next morning, Carlos couldn't help but feel proud. Proud of the strength his family had shown, proud of the example they had set for their children. This wasn't just a vacation anymore. This was a turning point, a story of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity, and of never letting injustice win. As they boarded the next flight, the family felt a new sense of freedom, a freedom that came from knowing they had done the right thing, no matter how hard it had been. And as for Emily, she had learned a hard lesson, one that she wouldn't soon forget. But more importantly, her actions had sparked a change, and that change was something the family would carry with them for the rest of their lives.